The barn door hadn't been opened since sometime in the spring of 1989, which you could tell by the way the grass had grown up against the bottom rail and been compressed there by one winter, and then left to grow again by the next, over and over, until the base of the door had its own archaeology of seasons that nobody had disturbed. Tyler Gunderson pulled on it anyway. He was 31 years old and he had driven 4 hours from Des Moines on a Thursday in October, and his brother Kevin had driven 2 hours from Iowa City, and they had met in the driveway of the farm that their grandfather Earl had worked for 40 years, and that their father had not been able to keep, and that a real estate investor in Ames now owned, and was planning to sell to a development company by the end of the year. The farmhouse was already empty. The fields had been rented to a neighbor for cash rent. The only thing left on the property that nobody had assigned a value to was the old barn at the back of the lot, and inside the barn was the reason Tyler had made the drive. He'd been 6 years old the last time he'd seen it. Earl had put him on the fender, not the seat, the fender, because Earl sat on the seat, and driven him across the east field in the early morning when the dew was still on the corn. Tyler remembered the sound more than anything else. The slow, low, two-beat sound of an engine that did not hurry, that popped along at its own pace, that seemed to know something about the morning that faster machines had forgotten. Earl died in February of 1988. Tyler was 6. The tractor stayed in the barn. The door gave finally, the hinges screaming with rust, and Tyler and Kevin stood in the opening and looked inside. If you've ever gone back for something you thought was gone, subscribe to this channel. A new story like this one every week, and not one of them ends the way you expect. Let me tell you what 35 years does to a machine that nobody visits. The 1948 John Deere Model B had been Earl Gunderson's primary farm tractor from the day he bought it new in the spring of 1949, a purchase that had taken 3 years of careful saving, and the sale of a small piece of timber ground that Earl had inherited from his own father, until the autumn of 1987, when Earl's heart had begun to do things that his doctor described in terms Earl found both specific and unhelpful. And the farm work had slowed, and then stopped, and then been handed quietly to neighbors who ran their own equipment on Earl's ground in exchange for a share of the harvest. In all those years, nearly 40 of them, the Model B had done the work that letter series John Deere tractors were built to do. It had pulled plows and cultivators and grain wagons and hay equipment through the heavy black Iowa soil that lay in the bottom ground of the Gunderson farm. It had started on cold February mornings when the thermometer on the machine shed wall read 7 degrees Fahrenheit. It had run on summer afternoons when the air above the field shimmered with heat and lesser machines overheated and stopped. It had never, in 40 years of working for Earl Gunderson, failed to complete a job. The two-cylinder engine, horizontal, lying flat between the frame rails, its massive cast-iron flywheel spinning at the rear, ran at low RPM and produced its torque at the bottom of its power range. It did not spin fast. It did not need to. The flywheel stored each combustion stroke and released it evenly, the way a river stores the rain of an entire watershed and releases it as a continuous, unhurried flow. The result was a machine that pulled with the steady authority of something that had no reason to doubt itself. When Earl could no longer farm, the Model B went into the barn. The doors closed, and what had been a working tractor became something else, a shape in the dark, accumulating the years. The first thing Tyler registered was the smell, old wood and old hay, and the particular mineral damp of a building that has been closed long enough for the air inside to develop its own character, separate from the air outside. The second thing was the light, or the absence of it, and then the presence of it, coming in through the gaps in the wall boards and through a large section of collapsed roof at the east end, the light entering in long diagonal shafts that illuminated the floating barn, dust they had disturbed by opening the door. The third thing was the tractor. It was in the far corner, which was the corner where Earl had always parked it, and it was under things. A section of the hayloft above it had come down at some point, Tyler guessed 10, maybe 15 years ago, and deposited a mass of rotted timber and compacted old hay across the rear axle and fenders. Vines had come in through a gap in the east wall and reached, in the manner of vines, for whatever was available, which had included the steering wheel, the exhaust stack, and the throttle lever on the steering column. The floor of the barn had drifted toward the tractor over the decades, hay dust and rodent-worked material and the slow accumulation of a building shedding itself inward, and the narrow front wheels were buried to the axle in this material. The paint was gone, not peeling, gone. What remained was a uniform orange-brown rust broken only by the colonies of green moss that had established themselves on every flat horizontal surface: the hood top, the fender edges, the fuel tank. The John Deere lettering on the hood was present only as a texture variation in the rust darker where the original paint had been protected by the raised letters, slightly lighter where it hadn't. Kevin stood beside Tyler in the barn door and was quiet for a long time, which was unusual for Kevin. "That's it," Kevin said. "That's it," Tyler said. Kevin looked at it for another moment. "Tyler, that thing is dead." Tyler didn't say anything. He walked to the tractor and put his hand on the hood. The metal was cold. The rust came off on his glove. Beneath the rust and the moss and the hay and the years, the shape of the machine was exactly what he remembered, exactly the shape that had been present in the left edge of his memory since he was 6 years old, when Earl had put him on the fender and driven him across the east field in the early morning. "Help me clear it," Tyler said. Kevin helped him clear it. It took most of Thursday and all of Friday morning. They worked from the outside in, moving the fallen timber first, then the compacted hay, then the vines, cutting them carefully from the steering wheel and the exhaust stack with a knife, not pulling, because Tyler had some instinct that the parts beneath needed to be treated with consideration. Kevin filmed some of it on his phone and stopped filming when he understood that what they were doing was not content but something else. By Friday noon, the tractor was clear of the debris. It was, standing in the barn light without its covering, considerably worse than it had appeared buried. The rear tires were flat and cracked beyond use, the rubber separated from the rims in long curling strips. The fuel tank had rust on the inside as well as the outside, visible when Tyler shone a light through the cap opening. The carburetor was gummed with 35 years of varnished fuel. The battery was long dead, but the Model B had a hand crank start and didn't require a battery to run, which was one of the design facts that Earl had been most specific about when he'd explained the tractor to Tyler in the way that grandfathers explain machinery, not as a lesson, but as a conversation, as if the machine's properties were simply interesting things to know. Tyler found the owner's manual under the seat pan. He found it because he lifted the seat pan to check the condition of the battery tray, an old habit from something he'd read, and the seat pan, when he pulled it, revealed not just the battery tray but a rusted tin box sitting on a square of oilcloth beside the tray. The tin was the kind that had once held pipe tobacco. The lid was sealed with old tar that had hardened to the consistency of rubber. Inside the tin, a photograph, a document, and a letter. The photograph was Earl on the Model B in what Tyler guessed was 1952. The tractor new and green, Earl 30-something and solid. The east field in the background, summer corn in the rows behind him. The document was the original bill of sale. 1948 John Deere Model B, serial number, options list, delivery date, price, $1,247, paid in full, March 1949. The letter was 4 pages, handwritten in pencil on lined paper, dated November 1987. It was addressed to Tyler. Now, to understand what that letter said, you need to understand what November 1987 was for Earl Gunderson. It was the last autumn he would work the farm. His heart had been giving the doctor reasons to use serious words since the previous spring, and Earl, who was a practical man, had begun to do the things that practical men do when they understand that time has stopped being unlimited. He had sorted his papers. He had talked to his son about the farm. He had done certain things with certain objects that he wanted to be sure were passed correctly. He had written the letter to Tyler, who was 5 years old and living in Des Moines, and who Earl saw twice a year and who had, the previous summer, sat on the fender of the Model B for a ride across the east field and fallen asleep against Earl's arm before they reached the far end. A thing that Earl had found, in some way he would not have been able to explain to anyone, very important. The letter began the way Earl began most things, without preamble. Tyler, this is for when you're old enough to find it. You know where to look because I showed you when you were small, though you won't remember. Under the seat pan. That was always where I kept the things that mattered. The tractor is the 1948 B. I bought it new. Your great-grandfather lent me half the money and told me the two-cylinder was the only engine worth owning, because it was the only engine you could fix yourself in a field with what you had in your pocket. He was right about that, as he was right about most things mechanical. When I am gone, and I will be gone before you can read this, I expect, don't let anyone tell you the old B is finished. Two cylinders don't give up. The engine will be seized or gunked or both, but cast iron doesn't die, it just waits. The manual is under the seat with this letter. Follow what it says for long storage restart. Be patient with the crank. Set it right or don't set it at all, because if it kicks back it'll take your wrist with it, and that's a lesson you only want to hear once. The farm may go to someone else. I understand that and I've made my peace with it, but the tractor is yours if you want it. Your grandfather, Earl. Tyler read the letter standing in the cold barn with the dust settling around him. He read it twice. Then he folded it carefully along its original creases and put it in his shirt pocket. Kevin was standing at the barn door. He hadn't heard. What was in it? Kevin said. A letter, Tyler said. From who? Earl. Kevin was quiet for a moment. What did it say? Tyler picked up the owner's manual, small and water-stained and fragile, but intact, and opened it to the section on long-term storage and restart procedure. It said to follow the manual, Tyler said. Harold Bess was 74 years old and had farmed the property immediately east of the Gunderson farm since 1969. He had known Earl for 20 years before Earl died, and he had watched the old farm go quiet and watched the barn lean further each winter, and had thought, privately, that the old B was probably beyond saving, but had not said this to anyone because it was not his to say. He came over Friday afternoon when he saw the barn door open and the lights on inside. He stood in the barn doorway and looked at the tractor, cleared of its debris, the rust and moss and years of abandonment fully visible in the afternoon light, and he said what he thought, which was his habit. That engine hasn't moved in 35 years, Harold said. Could be seized solid. Could be, Tyler said. He was reading the manual. Your grandfather was a good mechanic, kept it right, but 35 years is 35 years. I know it is. Harold looked at Tyler looking at the manual. He recognized something in the posture, the particular focus of a person who is looking for something specific and has reason to believe they'll find it. What are you reading? Harold said. Long storage restart procedure, Tyler said. Earl wrote in the margins. Harold came into the barn and stood beside Tyler and looked at the manual. In the margins of the restart section, in pencil, in Earl's handwriting, there were notes, specific notes, temperatures, timing, the number of turns to give the crank before attempting the start, the procedure for clearing the cylinders after long storage, the adjustment to make on the carburetor needle for a fuel system that had been dry for years. Harold read the notes for a long time. He was thinking about this, Harold said. He wrote these notes for someone who was going to do this job. Yes, Tyler said. Harold put his hat back on. All right, he said. Let's see what we have. They worked through Friday afternoon and into the evening. Tyler drained the varnished fuel from the tank in the carburetor bowl and flushed the system with clean kerosene. He freed the carburetor needle and cleaned the jets with a wire he found in Earl's old tool board on the wall, still hanging there, still organized in the way Earl had organized it. He checked the magneto contacts and cleaned them with a strip of emery cloth from the same board. He worked oil into the cylinders through the spark plug holes and let it sit for an hour as Earl's notes specified. The flywheel, when Harold tried it by hand, was stiff but not seized. It moved grudgingly, with resistance, but it moved, which meant the engine had not corroded solid, which meant the rings and the bore were still in contact in the way they needed to be, which meant there was a possibility. A possibility was enough. Kevin had long since put his phone away. He handed tools and held the light and did not say anything ironic or practical, which was his particular contribution to the afternoon. Saturday morning, Tyler set the carburetor needle adjustment that Earl's notes specified for a cold start on a previously stored engine. He checked the timing mark on the flywheel, visible beneath the accumulated grease and rust of 3 decades, still readable because cast iron marks do not disappear, they just wait. He filled the fuel tank with fresh gasoline. He primed the carburetor. He found the hand crank in the tool box, original to the tractor, still in the barn, still usable. Harold stood back. Kevin stood to the side. Tyler set the crank. He set it the way Earl's letter had said, at the right position in the compression cycle, not any position, the right one, because if the engine kicked back it would take his wrist with it, and Earl had told him this once, though he had been 5 years old and hadn't understood it then. He understood it now. He pulled. Nothing. He pulled again. Nothing. He checked the fuel feed, checked the spark, reset the crank. Third pull. Pop. 1 compression, 1 combustion. The flywheel turned 3 inches and stopped. But it had moved, it had fired. Harold Best took a slow breath. Tyler reset the crank, pulled. Pop. Then on the 6th attempt, after 35 years of silence in a collapsing barn in Iowa, the engine caught. Pop. Pop. Pop, pop, pop. The sound came up from the horizontal cylinders and rose through the exhaust stack and into the barn, and the barn held it for a moment before it found the gaps in the walls and the holes in the roof, and went out into the October morning. The barn filled with the thin gray exhaust of an engine running rich on its first minutes of operation, and the dust moved in the new air currents, and the cobwebs that remained on the far side of the tractor swayed in the exhaust draft. Pop, pop, pop. Tyler stood at the front of the tractor with one hand on the hood. His head was bowed. He was not crying. He was listening. Harold Best stood in the barn doorway with his hat in his hand. He was looking at the tractor, but he was thinking about Earl, about the way Earl had talked about this machine, about the November mornings he had watched Earl start it from his truck on the road, about the particular sound that had not been heard in this barn since the winter of 1987. "Your grandfather would have liked to see that," Harold said. Kevin was the only one who didn't say anything, but he wasn't filming either, which said more. Tyler Gunderson took the Model B home on a trailer in November of that year. He spent the following winter in his garage in Des Moines doing what the machine needed: new rear tires, rebuilt carburetor, fresh fuel lines, a proper valve job done with a set of tools he bought specifically for the purpose. He followed Earl's notes in the margins of the manual, and when the notes weren't sufficient, he found a 2-cylinder mechanic in Jefferson who had worked on letter series John Deeres for 50 years, and who spent one Saturday afternoon in Tyler's garage, providing the kind of instruction that manuals cannot. The following April, Tyler drove the Model B in a field for the first time in 35 years. His son, 4 years old, born 6 months after Tyler found the letter, sat on the fender. Pop, pop, pop. The sound carried across the flat April field, the way it had carried across Earl's east field in the early mornings of 40 farming seasons. Low and steady and unhurried, marking time in the particular way of an engine that has no reason to rush, because it has always known it will finish the job. Earl's letter is framed in Tyler's shop, next to the 1952 photograph of Earl on the Model B, the original bill of sale. $1,247, 1949, hangs beside them. The tractor is green again, not bright new green, the honest green of a machine that is old and knows it and works anyway, the green that was always underneath the rust, waiting for someone to come back and find it. Earl Gunderson bought the 1948 John Deere Model B because his father told him the two-cylinder was the only engine worth owning, and he farmed with it for 40 years. And when he knew his time was running short, he wrote a letter to a 5-year-old boy and hid it under the seat pan because he believed the boy would come back for it. He was right about that, as he was right about most things mechanical. Pop, pop, pop. 2 cylinders, 35 years in a dark barn, an engine that doesn't give up that waits, the way cast iron waits, which is to say without impatience and without doubt, until the right hands come along and give it a reason to run again. They said it was finished. Earl knew better. He always had.